Live. You can start your event.
Thank you. So, good morning to everyone, and good evening to my guest for the Amity Institute of International Studies, Professor Asanga Avayana Gunashekara. It's a pleasure to have you here. We invite you to the second in the Neighborhood Lecture series of AIIS. This lecture was envisioned with a very specific purpose, which was to talk and discuss and critically sort of analyze India's neighborhood policy, but not from the point of New Delhi, but from the eyes of the neighborhood itself. We had the first lecture with Professor Lailufa Yasmin from Dhaka University. And today we have great pleasure in having Professor Asanga Avayana Gunashekara, a Sri Lankan academic, geopolitics and foreign policy analyst. He is a political columnist and author. He is the author of the latest book that you can see in his slide, Teardrop Diplomacy, China-Sri Lanka Foray, one of the most one of the most pertinent themes of discussion as far as India's foreign policy in neighborhood is also concerned, which is to navigate China's foray in India's neighborhood. He is a visiting professor for geopolitics and global leadership at Northern Kentucky University and a visiting lecturer in international political economy for the University of London, and teaches international security at University of Colombo. Avayana Gunashekara has more than a decade of experience in government administration, serving as the head of several institutions to positions at the board level. His commentaries on international relations and geopolitics are published by Observer Research Foundation, London School of Economics, and South Asia Journal. He writes the monthly column Deadline Colombo for IPCS think tank in New Delhi. He is the former founding director general of the Institute of National Security Studies, Sri Lanka, and was the former executive director of the Lakshman Kadirgamar Institute of International Relations and Strategic Studies, which is a Sri Lankan government foreign policy think tank. So without any further ado, I request Asanga to now take over the virtual floor. May speak for like half an hour or something, so that we have another half an hour for questions and answers from the students and my faculty member colleagues from the Institute. And we are also pleased to have the director and head of Amity Institute of International Studies, Professor Nagalakshmi Raman, as a panelist in the board. Thank you, Asanga, and the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Monish, and deeply honored for the invitation, Professor Raman. And I think obviously, so I will stick to the 30-minute time frame, like Dr. Monish mentioned. So, and we will have a more interactive discussion after that. So let me begin with basically. I will touch on the Indo-Lanka relations, and basically starting from 2005, the Rajapaksa 1.0, which is Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was the president back then, 2005 to 15. Then Gotabaya Rajapaksa was the former president, 2019 to 2022. I will call that 2.0 Rajapaksa. Then the Sirisena Wickremesinghe, which is another regime we had from 15 to 19, and then the present Wickremesinghe regime. So these are the four, basically from starting from 2005, the regimes that I will touch on how the relationship has moved, foreign relations, bilateral relations, economic, as well as how the geopolitical context, which I've sort of been working on for my last few books, Sri Lanka at Crossroads, The Conundrum of an Island, and then the new book, which is the Teardrop Diplomacy, which I have focused on the geoeconomics, how it sort of translates to geopolitical ambitions of extra-regional powers such as China. So China in the equation in Sri Lanka and how it impacts Sri Lanka's foreign policy and how it also impacts the bilateral relationship between India and Sri Lanka is also discussed in the presentation. And the emerging and future trends for this relationship and how, what are the sort of the future potential for the relationship is also discussed. So Indo-Lanka relations, if you look at it, India's geopolitical and geoeconomic significance of India is quite, you have to look at it from a geopolitical lens and a geoeconomics lens. So the US-China tension, which is in the, the discuss, like right now I'm in Washington, so I've captured this very clearly, the US-China tension and the role of India in the, basically India in the geo as well as in the marine spheres in South Asia. Some of my writings you could see from the ORF Observer Research Foundation, which I sort of discussed. And the India's foreign policy posture and its position on neighborhood, immediate neighborhood, such as Sri Lanka, and how the neighborhood first policy impacts nations like Sri Lanka is really important. And the SAGAR, which is the security and the growth policy of Prime Minister Modi. If you revisit the Modi doctrine book, when Prime Minister Modi was elected back then, there was a book that was published called Modi Doctrine. So I authored one chapter, the importance of SAGAR and neighborhood first policy when Prime Minister announced back then, and how Sri Lanka can play a pivotal role in both of these policies is discussed. And there I did see the China factor also because of the growing significant footprint of China in Sri Lanka and how it would impact the relationship. So India's reading and posture on Indo-Pacific is also really important in the larger geopolitical connotation. And in geoeconomics, basically, as the world's largest population, India, and the fastest growing economy, how countries like Sri Lanka could benefit is also important in this equation. So Sri Lanka's geopolitical and geoeconomic significance, when you look at it, the geopolitical lens is basically the US-China and China-India tension, and how the Sri Lanka's role in this tension, and what is sort of is discussed in my new book, the Teardrop Diplomacy. So Sri Lanka's foreign policy posture in this geopolitical rivalry and tension is really important. Sri Lanka's position on BRI and the Indo-Pacific is basically, I call it, Sri Lanka is sandwiched between the two, the Indo-Pacific as well as the BRI. The geoeconomics, if you look at it, the how Sri Lanka's position, its geostrategic position in the Indian Ocean, and how the recent visit of the Chinese spy ship, I have discussed how the geoeconomics of China and how it sort of transferred into geopolitical ambition. And that I'll come to that slide in a bit. So the Indo-Lanka relations, if you look at it, two clear, basically, views on the domestic view as well as the foreign policy view. The domestic political view is the grievances of the Tamilians or the Tamil diaspora is a clear India's interest, and the devolution of power, which is discussed many regimes. If you look at it from Prime Minister Modi's regime, it's been discussed from Mahinda Rajapaksa's time to the Gotabaya Rajapaksa's, Vikram Singha's time. So all of the four regimes I mentioned have sort of gone through this 13th Amendment. But during Mahinda Rajapaksa's time, 2005 to 15, which he promises 13 plus, which is the devolution to go beyond, and which has never been fulfilled by the Colombo regimes that was there. And it is a grievance that has been there, and it is discussed. Even last month, it was discussed in Colombo by India's External Affairs Minister, the importance of having the devolution of power. The next is the reconciliation process after the 2009. So how Sri Lanka should move into a reconciliation footing after the ending of the civil war for 3 decades, and the human rights concerns of the minorities is also a concern for India, and the political influence by China on the local political parties, which I have captured in my new book. Basically, the funding political parties, as well as trying to create a narrative on an influence, significant influence in the local politics, is a concern for India. And Chinese influence on elite capture. Now, this has been clearly documented in a Carnegie report, if you look at the Carnegie South Asia report. So there is a clear elite capture in Sri Lanka that's going on, and which is quite a dangerous situation, even back then when it was traced back then. And so the domestic politics, I think it's a serious area, the China factor. The foreign policy is also, if you look at it, China's growing influence in geoeconomics, in infrastructure projects, and has impacted India's immediate security concerns. It's a concern for India. The fishermen issue is also an area which has been discussed basically many times, the South Indian fishermen's problem. So these are the main concerns that is there between the two countries. That are the so if you look at this basically the table, I have put the Rajapaksa, the regimes. If you look at the Rajapaksa and the Sirisena regime and the Wickremesinghe regime, so you can see on the column, and then on the basically I have tried to map the foreign policy posture of the regime. For example, the Rajapaksa 1.0 from 2005 to 15 was more pro-China tilted foreign policy that they took. The second, which is his brother Gotabaya, was also on the same posture. Sirisena Wickremesinghe regime had a sort of a more balanced, I would say, a posture, like balancing between China and the US and the others. But that regime ended in 2019. And right now, the present Wickremesinghe regime is somewhat trying to recalibrate the previous regime's pro-China tilted foreign policy towards a more balanced posture. And but I say this with multiple pressure that is coming into the president, because he's an appointed president backed by the Rajapaksa regime's parliament, which is the parliament is controlled, majority is controlled by the Rajapaksas. So if you look the CCP or the political party influence, you can see from regime to regime, I have captured it. And in the present, I would say it's a continuation of the previous, unfortunately, but then because of the Rajapaksa majority in the parliament of Sri Lanka. So, so the political party influence is still the same. Now, this particular table, I've captured it in my book in different chapters. This is after a field research I did in Sri Lanka, about 70 interviews I carried out. And most of the data that was captured was for the USAID project in Sri Lanka. But some of the political data that I captured was before the crisis, about 6-7 months before the crisis. We saw some of the policy decisions that was taken, economic policy, for example, would have some significant impact towards the country. And then also the amendments such as the constitutional amendments that was introduced by the previous regime, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, will have a significant impact, because what he did was he altered the constitution, bringing in the powers from parliament to the executive branch. And that impacted minority communities, commitments towards 13th Amendment, the devolution of power, which his own minister, I have put that in this, if you can see, R2.0, which is Rajapaksa, Gotabaya Rajapaksa 2.0. So where his own minister rejects the 13th Amendment, he says that he does not believe, which is the own minister of provincial council. So that particular data point was very important, because that was the policy of the Rajapaksa regime, which had a significant impact to India's relationship, India-Sri Lanka, because India's concern was to address these issues of the Tamilian grievances. And the other factor is that, like now today in the present regime, there is some commitment, which the president has discussed about it, and which is really good. So you're actually moving away and recalibrating the previous position. The human rights and the reconciliation, if you look at it, the commitment, Sri Lanka co-sponsored its own resolution of addressing human rights and multiple issues, but it went back again to basically not addressing any of that, and moving out of the recommendations that was given. So it's the Prevention of Terrorism, PTA is the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and which has been used to arrest protesters, as well as, under the Terrorism Act. So it is a kind of a draconian act, which the European Union and many US and many others have spoken against, and to repeal the PTA. So Wickremesinghe has looked at the present regime to replace it with a better sort of a act. And but this is under discussion, and how the new act would be. So the economic, I see a tremendous progress right now, because of moving towards IMF, and India's assistance, especially the G20, I think today, which is happening in Bangalore, where Sri Lanka is a main discussion point, where assisting Sri Lankan economy on debt restructuring, and India played a pivotal role in this regard. So the militarization was also a huge concern for India, as well as many other liberal democracies, because Sri Lanka never had a regime with 28 military appointments, which was the former regime had. And people, as well as the bureaucracy, general public, had a concern on that. Although the Rajapaksas did not read that, I think the academics, as well as the others in the country, did read it really carefully and understood that this was going in the wrong direction. So all this has been sort of recalibrated and reset right now by the Wickremesinghe. And this is from last month, where again the devolution of power, the 13th Amendment, where Buddhist priest is burning it. You can see the ultra-nationalists, the left leaning, sort of re-emerging back again. So they're coming with a theme of neoliberalism, trying to sort of attack the neoliberalism as the main cause for the Sri Lankan crisis was neoliberalism. And they're pitching this, in different ways, as well as, so this would be a very dangerous, I would say the next few months will be very crucial for Sri Lanka, because of this pitch and how the ultra-nationalists of Rajapaksas will use this, saying that the crisis was not because of anything else. It was because of neoliberal practices. And it was the West that was behind and blaming the IMF reforms. So if Sri Lanka gets into this particular trap, I warn, I mean, it's going to be a serious issue. And it's going to be an issue it's a challenge for India as well as also for Sri Lanka. It's actually a position to move away from the genuine reconciliation process, addressing the human rights concerns. And also, what Sri Lanka requires right now with this financial crisis, economic crisis, is to re-engage with its diaspora. So what you would see is a complete disengagement if you get into this footing. So you can see the ultra-nationalist sentiments coming back again. Basically my book, the new book, captures on the Gotabaya Rajapaksa's regime, which is the previous regime, 2019 until 2022. What made the former president, get into a heavy militarized, then the inward policy economic policy prescriptions, then accepting, China's position on various, policies that, for example, the economic development model, and discussing, freely on this. So what made him do that? So it's a kind of a analytical based on the regime of Gotabaya Rajapaksa. So I think here I have put Dr. Sriraj Datta. I mean, she clearly says that to take the relations to a higher level, India, Sri Lanka, it is imperative that Colombo adequately address India's apprehension about Colombo's lack of sensitivity. Now, the sensitivity, what Dr. Radha is talking is basically captured in, like if you look at it from each incident, is Chinese submarine visits in 2014, or the Chinese spy ship visit is a very clear example recently which happened. So if I go back, let me go to that particular slide and come back quickly. I think that's important. I go there. So the reason, this one. So what really happened was, this is a very clear example, basically in August last year. So where the Chinese Yang Wangfei visited Hambantota, when India clearly, New Delhi gave a signal saying that, we should not bring this particular ship because it's a clear security concern for India as well as for Sri Lanka. Sri Lankan authorities tried to sort of, several times tried to stop this coming into Hambantota port, but they couldn't stop. The analysis here is basically China's influence was so strong during Gotabaya Rajapaksa's regime, and it has managed even during the Vikram Singha regime to get into Hambantota port, and even with concerns from India. So what you see is a significant geo-economic project built by China, Hambantota port, converting it to achieve geopolitical objectives. Basically, the teardrop diplomacy, I clearly highlighted in my book, how this geopolitical project would get into a geostrategic concern. Let me come to that. Yeah, so I call it actually, I mean, a lot of people try to argue on this Chinese presence in Sri Lanka as a debt trap diplomacy by China. The port that was taken for 99 years and all that, but I see it as then they try to justify and debunk it also, saying that if you look at the Chinese loans are equal to Japanese loans, is about 10%. So why you call it a debt trap? But I don't think the quantitative data does capture the strategic depth of the concern here. So what I call, I try to, I see it as a strategic trap more than a debt trap. What China has is a strategic trap, and I call it a strategic trap because of three areas. The first is because of the significant political party funding that is coming in, and or either to the regime or to the opposition parties. So to establish, so this is happening right now in Sri Lanka. So the second is basically the China's support on the human rights, and basically Sri Lankan regime, the previous regime discussed even about China's human rights concerns in Xinjiang, which we have never done in Sri Lankan foreign policy. We had not spoken of China's human rights issues. So where China has supported Sri Lanka, the Human Rights Council, basically when the Human Rights Council gives the recommendations on areas that and China supports Sri Lankan regime of the Rajapaksas, clearly not to address those issues. And the third is the military, which is the most, I would say, the sensitive area, which China has 80% of the telecommunication network under Huawei in Sri Lanka. So they operate the backbone, and also many other for surveillance, for police, etc. So this three areas, I think, is basically that's I would see as a strategic trap coming in. And if you look at the port of Hambantota, some of the arguments saying that the military ships cannot enter, debunking it, saying that enter Hambantota is incorrect. Because my interactions as the former Director General, as the National Security think tank, so with the Sri Lankan Navy, and also it can be all, transferred into a forward logistics space, is the exact thing which the Pentagon reports, as well as the which captures in the US. So it could be used if it gets on to, right now, according to the Sri Lankan Prime Minister right now, Dinesh Gunawardena, who is serving as the Prime Minister, he says about the lease agreement of China is basically it could be further extended. And this shows how loose these agreements are. And they were not transparent, they were not shared with the general public. And so there's opaqueness in the Chinese loans, as well as someone. So, and the general public actually has a sort of an understanding now, I would say, after the crisis, that where you need to look at these projects, because that was not making any financial benefits. There was no benefits at all coming in from like Matala Airport, the international airport. There was no flights for many years. So all this was a concern, and they start raising concerns, which became an issue to China also. So now, if you look at the what I mentioned on the political party, as well as the human rights and the military. So all of these three dimensions has an impact to India-Sri Lanka relations. Now, these are few examples I have given where think tanks also, private think tanks, get into implementing Huawei strategies and discussing important, which think tanks have now not done in Sri Lanka, that sort of activity. So you can see slowly China is building that, which is a danger to the Indo-Lanka relations. We are building that, and then you have a significant, clear signal coming in to different areas. And Gotabaya Rajapaksa's previous regime, unfortunately, did not see that until things got worse, and it was very unfortunate that the country right now in a significant serious crisis now. So the debt crisis, if you look at it to understand Sri Lanka's issue, I'll just go to that slide, and then yeah. So some of the now the is China the only factor? Actually, China is not the only factor. It is a significant factor according to the research I have done and the work that I've sort of published right now. If you look at the Sri Lankan debt stock, starting from the two arrows here, the 2005, which is the Rajapaksa regime beginning of Mahinda Rajapaksa, to 2015, the R1.0, if you look, you see the climb from 11 billion to 43 billion. So the climb was like fourfold, and debt, this is the external debt stock. So there's a significant climb, and the BRI started in 2013, and Hambantota and all these projects started coming in, and the massive amounts of loans that Sri Lanka took. Some of the loans were taken for 6.5% interest rates. So they were very high. And you can't compare with the Japanese loans. That's why, so they were below 2%. And you could see, the returns on these projects were not much. And it was the expected returns were not there. And so that's why Sri Lanka, we got into an insolvency issue, a liquidity issue, and right now, so there's no funds to pay for these projects. And so in this sort of situation, I mean, you could see the crisis. This is the Sri Lankan crisis. I will not go into detail, but I will share you these slides to understand. But the position of, I mean, when we hit the crisis, the Sri Lanka, the first country to come to rescue was India. That was for $4 billion in 2022. And if India did not come to, at that particular point, Sri Lanka would have been in a serious, issue with, with the essential foods, the essential medicine, and all these items. So India started providing that. So the stability was created by India, and it's a sort of right now, India is taking the leadership, even in the G20, to discuss and to bring some sort of standards, bring in IMF, Japan, as well as the G20, nations to discuss on how Sri Lanka could be helped in the debt restructuring. What China has offered is a debt moratorium for 2 years. So it's kind of a relief for 2 years, but still the Sri Lankan authorities are discussing with the Chinese, basically creditors, how we could restructure. So I think let me go to the last particular slide. I'll share you these slides so that you this one is also quite interesting. What's happening in the region, it has to be understood also, not only Sri Lanka. So I've given this chart, basically, I've captured this on my book, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and how these countries have sort of moved gradually towards Chinese policies, different policies, and how they have supported. And this gives a sort of a regional perspective on what's going on in the region, and that's also, I think, important of understand. So the emerging trends is basically how do you sort of fix this, bring stability to the country. It's number one. Sri Lanka requires stability, and India is actually providing that in 3 different areas: in infrastructure, in financial assistance, and also in also from the international arena, from the IMF, as well as bringing in some sort of introduce common standards and principles, which IMF is trying to do. So India is helping right now. And if you look at there is another sort of area where a trend, which is India and US could push for a more active and a rigorous country-specific commitments for free and open Indo-Pacific. That's really important, because Sri Lanka, as an island neutral, geostrategically located, has a significant role in the Indian Ocean security. So, so in terms of the maritime security, there's a huge role. In terms of the Indo-Pacific economic framework, there's another significant role, the IPEF, which is to set standards. In most of these projects, which I discussed earlier, require standards. The EIA standards, environmental impact assessments, are not done. So these areas can be addressed from bringing some sort of standards to the country. And recalibration of the Sri Lankan foreign policy to a balanced foreign policy is an immediate requirement, which Wickremesinghe is actually trying to do, the present president. But remember that the present president is appointed by the previous president, and he was not elected. So the elections is what the people of Sri Lanka is asking right now. And whether it requires investment in existing like minilaterals, which is between Sri Lanka, Maldives, and India, and an important minilateral which all three countries reach, needs in more investment, as well as investment to develop in terms of security, in terms of in other sectors. So it's important. And the toolkit, another area which Sri Lanka could benefit and India could help, is to introduce some sort of toolkit, which is, the Asia ASP. I helped, basically, I was part of the project team to develop this, the ASPI BRI toolkit, very important. And it is a toolkit to develop, the Chinese processes and improve Chinese processes, such as in Port City in Sri Lanka, a massive port that was an area that was taken by China. But how do we develop or improve, processes in these projects is important. So that's another area where India could also push to, implement in these neighboring countries. Strengthening the democratic process is very important, which is, like I mentioned, the heavy militarization and moving away from constitutional amendments. So all that requires time, as well as all that requires recalibration to get back to sort of democratic norms. But if Sri Lanka is to gain something out of this whole, setting the standards, bringing the IMF, and being with the sort of like-minded partners, it's important that you address the human rights, the minority issues, and all that. So the fighting corruption is also a serious issue. I mean, during the crisis in Sri Lanka, when I interviewed many of the protesters, one of the main points they mentioned was corruption. So not any of the other points that I mentioned, it was corruption at the forefront. So the significant corruption, as well as why isn't the elites, political elites, some of them who are accused and never gone to jail, was a concern for the protesters in Sri Lanka. So IMF has actually put, I'm very happy about that they have made it one significant point that corruption, fighting corruption and assisting on corruption is really important. So that's another area, I would say, that both countries can help in this regard. So the future trajectory that I see is that India, as the largest population, in the world now, and the largest growing market economy. There's a huge potential for countries like Sri Lanka to integrate into the Indian economic system, so Indian economy. If you look at the Colombo port, the 70% of the the container shipments is going into India, the transshipments. The West Container Terminal is the best example that India has invested and now right now developing. So by integrating into Indian economy, I see that a huge potential for Sri Lanka, especially as a maritime hub. In other sectors also, IT, telecom, and logistics, which I mentioned, tourism sector, which is a large amount of Indian tourists visiting. So those are areas that requires, I think, significant investment, and there is a huge potential of growth. The FDIs, very, impressed on India's FDIs, recent FDIs. The achievements from 162 nations, with 61 sectors that India has gained. And I don't think any other country has gained that sort of significant FDIs. So there is a way that outsourcing service sectors, many other areas that Sri Lanka could benefit out of these. When India becomes one of the main points for FDIs. The India-Sri Lanka pivotal as a pivotal contributor to Indo-Pacific strategy. Now that's a really important area which both countries can contribute, especially Sri Lanka as a maritime nation, and India, who's looking at focusing on maritime security. So that's why I mentioned earlier also the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, a very important area that both countries can benefit. And when it comes to quadrilateral, another question that I always get questioned on, they ask me on how countries like Sri Lanka, can they be part of it? And definitely, so, being with it could basically involve, other countries like Sri Lanka, based on their needs and comfort levels. So it doesn't need to be a quad partner, but then it could become according to the needs as well as the comfort levels of the country. So I think I'll conclude here and take your questions, and I'm happy to share the slides with you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Asanga. Thank you so much. And I think there's so much that you have packed in terms of providing food for thought to the students, and right from the broad geopolitics and geoeconomics to the regional sort of bilateral engagement, up to the internal sort of issues in Sri Lanka. So we have around 15 minutes to go before my colleagues or some students raise their hands. I would start by asking, the quintessential question in this neighborhood lecture series, which I intend to ask everyone from the neighborhood, and which is that there is a way in which India defines or redefines or views its neighborhood, right? And there is a way in which each of what we call as the immediate neighbors sort of like define and view their neighborhood. Bangladesh has a way of viewing it. So my first question would be, how according to you is does Colombo or Sri Lanka view its neighborhood? Who are what is the rank prioritization in terms of neighbors or extended neighbors? What's the view and how it has changed over a period of time? The second question, because of where you are located right now, would be that if you could tell us a little bit more on what is the view in Washington, regarding Sri Lanka's foreign policy posture, and whatever is happening inside Sri Lanka. How do you see the debate in Washington regarding this? So let me start off with these two questions while I wait for my other colleagues to intervene. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Monish. Yes, the view is basically yeah. Can you hear me? Sorry. Yeah, the view is basically from Colombo India has been sort of view during the civil war time, as you probably know. There's been sort of negative ways of looking at India, and because of the Tamilian civil war. And if you look at different times, 1987, the Indo-Lanka Accord. So that's another, where devolution of power was introduced. So I think different times they've taken view because of the closest neighbor, India, Sri Lanka, closest neighbor is India. I captured in my Sri Lanka at Crossroads, I call it the Kaveri Delta influence, which is the Dravidian influence towards the north of the island. It's been there from 2000 years history. And it's going to remain, what I argue is that it's going to remain for the next 2000 years or so. The Sri Lankan government in Colombo and New Delhi would have to sort of, work on this parameter. That's an area that, the influence will be there to the Sri Lankans north and the east. So it's an influence that you would have to work with, the larger Tamilian diaspora that is there. Now, a few weeks ago in Washington, the House of Representatives, Tamilian diaspora has sent a letter. They're asking back again a federal state from the US regime. So I received that letter, and when I read it, they are going to the historical factors that the government is not addressing. Government is neglecting this. So the view has been, because of India's push towards devolution, the ultra-nationalists in Sri Lanka sees it as India, twisting the arm or pressurizing the regime, which is incorrect. India is trying to help here. So I think the young people that's the protest, during the protest and all that I interview, none of them see this. They are more progressive, I would say. So I think the ultra-nationalists, the leftists only see that, it's an intervention, intervening into sovereignty. And when the senior politicians also talk about this, it gets into, serious. So the view is actually, I would say, multifaceted. So it's not one single view. And it's important to understand that, the dimension of that. So the second question you mentioned was, Washington is mainly on focus is about China. So China in Sri Lanka, I would say. And they see, the Indo-Pacific strategy is the forefront of their, the Washington's, it's a bipartisan consensus here on China and Chinese aggressiveness in basically in Pacific Islands, in the littorals of Indian Ocean. There is a concern, serious concern, and it is it's more about that, about China, than anything else. So the economic crisis, they would see it as it's sort of a larger regional view. Like in Bangladesh is going through it now. They have come forward to the IMF. The Pakistan is a concern. So I think but India as a strong partner, especially in the Quad, as well as working in many areas. can play a huge role in the region. That's no doubt. And I can see that perspective from here.
Thank you so much. I see two hands raised. So we'll take these two questions together, and I request the students to be, oh, there are many. I'll take, wait, I'll take three in a group so that we can have 2 rounds before we finish the session. And I request the ones who are asking questions to be very brief, be pointed in your questions, right? So we can cover everyone. So I'll start with Dr. Shirish Pathak, who is my colleague, and then Dhuminda Dayananda and Shrishti Agarwal. So Shirish, you can start. Shirish, you're there? Shrishti, you are there? You can ask your question. Can the technical team please allow attendees to ask questions? Hello? Can a technical team please allow attendees to ask questions?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, can you please allow attendees to ask questions? They are not able to ask questions.
Yes. Now they can
Yes,
unmute
Shirish.
themselves. Yes.
Yes, Shirish, you can unmute and ask.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Now I'm getting the option, sir. Thank you so much. So, first of all, I wish to congratulate Professor Asanga for such a elaborative presentation. It was actually precise and very much relevant. There's one simple question, but before I put that question, I need to convey my regards to our Sri Lankan brethren, because this is a difficult time for Sri Lankan people, but we are very much sure that they will come out from their vitality. And there's one reason behind that, because somehow every country is having justified complexity in their foreign policy, but somehow we can witness that in the whole world, Sri Lankan diplomacy is enjoying a kind of goodwill. Actually, it's not that Sri Lanka is being cornered by some set of countries. So I think because of this international community response, very soon Sri Lankan will be able to come up with this particular crisis. My question is regarded to domestic milieu, actually, because social cultural boundaries, what we share together, social cultural boundaries, what we can't ignore, they often don't understand, they don't confine in political boundaries. So we are having some sensibilities towards Sri Lankan domestic politics. Because of that particular mass mobilization is still, there is a one particular regime which is there. And there's a one more question that how Tamil problem is still yet to be addressed. Whether I have just read some news that somebody was claiming that Prabhakaran was still alive. One thing, and what's about political development? Whether within this crisis, after this crisis, what is your understanding, estimation, how Sri Lankan will be able to capture their political development, how they will be able to accommodate political development in their domestic politics. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll take 2 more questions. One, Shrishti, very quick. Shrishti, please ask your question quickly. Dhuminda?
Yeah. So at present, I am in USA. So from here, it is good evening. So my point is, am I audible?
Yes, please ask the question.
Okay. Yeah. So I have read the book of our professor, Conundrum of an Island Nation, and I found that most of the experts are talking about this neutrality and balancing of foreign policy or whatever policies in Sri Lanka. So, but my understanding is, even though people say, okay, we need to balance and be neutral, but in practice, it is very difficult because of our geopolitical situation, I guess. So that is why, even though the professor also himself argued in his book also about this, we don't have a kind of defined foreign policy or national security policy. But I think that may be the reason why the governments used to not to have defined foreign policy or security policies, because of if they have it, it is difficult for them to maintain neutrality or a kind of balance. But what if I suggest that now, for example, if a government lean towards
So,
China, then the other parties will disagree.
Mr. Dayananda, I am sorry to intervene, but I would like to ask you, I would like you to ask the question, because we have other
Okay.
questions.
Okay, so my question is, what if we have a like defined foreign policy and national security policy uh, without without changing it for over the coming years, and maybe it may be dissatisfy some other powers, but what if we have a certain written policy, foreign policy and a security policy to the country? So what would it be? How it affects the future?
Thank you. Ayushi? Ayushi? Ayushi's question is, can you please give an example of improved processes? Can you give an example of improved processes in BRI project with respect to the toolkit idea pitched in the earlier slide? I think it's the ASPI slide you were talking about. So we'll take these three questions and maybe we'll have another round before we end the session. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. It was very important observations and that you all made. Let me go to the first question. Dr. Shrish, on political development is very important. And what your question was more toward the Tamilian issue, which is a very serious concern in Sri Lanka. And without the political stability, you cannot have the economic growth or economic, the prosperity that the country it requires, because of various security concerns come in to the country, and various actors play, has a dysfunction. I mean, has dysfunctional roles. So it's very, very sad that a country beautiful as Sri Lanka, with so much of prospects, has not made into at least getting into we became a middle to a country with the upper middle income category, but then we went back again now. So you can see the political stability is main key area. Your question, I mean, I can answer in one particular phrase on Sri Lanka requires is what is a diaspora re-engagement strategy. What I say when I say diaspora, diaspora means the Tamilian, the Sinhalese, as well as all the others who are living outside and can contribute immensely. Now, I met so many in the United States. They don't want to even go to the Sri Lankan High Commission. They don't want to associate with any Sri Lankan governments or politicians due to various factors, be it corruption, be it various other areas, and they are concerned. But they've done so much, contributing to the countries they are living in. So they can bring, I mean, Sri Lanka is a very small, 20 million comparatively to many other South Asian countries. So it can bring in a lot of prosperity to the country. Reintegrating diaspora means reintegrating also the former LTT also. So here's the problem where Rajapaksa went wrong, was that he wanted to choose who are the LTTs and who are not the LTTs. This, in fact, the former president told me this when I was, engaging with the National Reconciliation conferences at the Lakshman Kadrigam Institute. So former president clearly said that we don't reconcile with the LTTE. So the problem is with the LTTE. The problem is with the diaspora, the Tamilian diaspora, who is, asking for the rights. So this is where the issue is. It's you need to reintegrate. You need to find the political solution, and India could help. And with the ultra-nationalist push that is coming in, always when there is a solution, that actually drags the country far behind. And it's time that we overcome this. And it's very important that India assist in this regard. The next question on Duminda is a very important question on the foreign policy written. Why we couldn't have, the reason it's not written is also because of the positions. Each political manifesto articulates the foreign policy posture. For example, for President Sirisena, Maithripala Sirisena, it's called Balance and Asia-centric foreign policy. And at that time, if you remember in my book, I sort of discussing that, what does it even mean, balance and Asia-centric? So the articulate, you are writing a clear policy guideline definitely helps a country. Such as, we worked on the national defense policy. Sri Lanka has a defense policy now because we worked for about 4 years. Basically the all three forces, tri-forces of Sri Lanka, and compiled this document. But unfortunately, the previous government, locked it on, kept it away from the general public. That was incorrect because they wanted to produce their own document. So the South Asian, the problem here is that the regime to regime, you can't keep changing the policies that would impact. So it's important to have a written policy. To answer your question, so it's always good to have a balance. Foreign policy. Sri Lanka has always maintained that. And important to revisit also the Sri Lanka's contributions to the international community, such as law of the sea, the India Ocean Zone of Peace. So there's a lot to be written, but unfortunately, it's not done. The BRI toolkit is available. If you go to ASPI website, it's available to East Asia right now, and they're translating into different countries, Sri Lanka. So the research was done, in Sri Lanka research was done. I did that research with my colleagues. And an example is, for example, the Port City project, or the terminal project in Sri Lanka, where the Chinese terminal operators are working on. And now to set a standard is labor laws. So are they following the country's laws? Another example is the environment EIA, whether certain projects such as what they build in near the Matala airport. Matala is the airport in the south, and they built it closer to a bird sanctuary, a natural bird sanctuary. So there is obviously the Auditor General is questioning. There's a report written by the Sri Lankan Auditor General that who gave the authority to do this. Where is the environmental EIA clearance, the environmental impact assessment? Has it been properly done? So I think the Chinese are also learning in this process. They know where they have gone wrong in certain projects. Port City was the best example. So they try to sort of bring back good practices, right? Assisting the community, or listening more towards fishermen who are impacted, like environmental concerns. So it's important. So it's sort of a learning process, and the toolkit helps the stakeholders as well as the developers to improve the processes, because none of these projects we can't close these projects. We can only improve it.
Thank you. So we have the last set of 3 questions before we end the session. Aditi, can you quickly ask your question? Then I can read out the other 2 questions. Aditi?
Hello. Hello.
Yes.
Sorry, am I audible now?
Your voice is
Hello.
breaking.
Okay, so sorry. Is it better now?
Yes.
Okay, I wanted to ask, you mentioned that, thanks for the session. I wanted to ask that you mentioned that the Sri Lankan diaspora is not as connected. or not as united? Why do you think that is? And that's especially in such a stark comparison to the Indian diaspora, which does seem to have a lot more unity and a sense of oneness in it, even across continents.
Okay, thank you. The second question is from Moksha Pillai, an MA student. China's economic have and influence in Sri Lanka has been difficult for fellow stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific to challenge and substitute. How effective can the IPEF be to ensure zone balancing in the region and offer Colombo some respite from the over-dependence on Beijing? The third and the last question is, what are some of the pitfalls of Chinese FDI in Sri Lanka? Given the lack of EIAs provided to the government, how does this pan out for future Chinese aid receivers? So these are the last three questions. The last question was asked by Divarkar Day, a PhD scholar. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, the first question on diaspora, the why they are not united is because of the I would say the 3-decade war, the different policies that different regimes took and has impacted. There are diaspora migration patterns are also different. There are 80s, 90s, then larger amount of Sri Lankan population started leaving the country last year and this year. So you see that different migration patterns, and either you have a concern with the regime or the I think the patterns of migration are different. The main issue is like they don't want to do anything with it. The regime is because of a large amount of corruption. Most of the diaspora that I have interviewed or spoken discuss about large corruptions. When they try to do something, a project in Sri Lanka, the political elites discuss on high figures. So the corruption basically is one of the main areas, and then they don't want to associate because of the sensitivity towards mainly political sensitivities. So the main, and it's a huge loss for the country, and I see there's a huge potential that diaspora could play. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the next question, is a very important area because of the standards, the 4 pillars that IPEF speaks about of setting standards in basically projects when it comes to sustainability, various areas, So all 4 areas that Sri Lanka could benefit. Some of the accountability issues that some of the projects had, the non-transparent nature of certain projects, certain agreements was not shared with Sri Lankan public. Nobody in Sri Lanka has seen the 99-year lease with Hambantota Port. Only the select group of policymakers have seen. Then there are different variations and there are different sort of narratives on that. So the transparency has to be improved on these projects. And so the IPEF is a very good, I would say, a solution, can improve on those 4 areas, the 4 pillars. And it has also on the corruption area also, on economic crimes, and how countries could, contribute as well as get together and work on. It needs, it's new, the IPEF, but then IPEF requires investments from many countries in getting into some sort of building those standards in the processes. The FDI, the last question. I mean, it's clearly the Chinese FDIs. If you look at it's not about the FDIs. It's more about the Chinese loans. So FDIs are sort of not so significant, but then the loans are the biggest concern for Sri Lanka because of the factors I mentioned, the high interest rates, the opaqueness. They were not, the conditionality is not clear. You cannot be compared with the other loans. But China is not the only concern. I mean, it's not fair say that China is the only concern, that that triggered the crisis. It's accumulation of all that, as well as the external factors, which is the the COVID issue, as well as the the loss of tourism, the remittances. Then you have the Ukraine war. So there are external factors also. But the opaqueness, the non-transparency are the clear areas that the Sri Lankan regime would need to sort of improve and introduce some sort of bringing some standards. So the new book actually discuss about that, giving more focus on setting standards and how important, and how India could also assist New Delhi, because the more we get into, like, for example, like projects like in the north, the if you look at the recent the wind farm project, like it became a serious concern for New Delhi because of the close proximity to India, the Chinese project. So I think with more transparency, more communication channels, I think Sri Lanka can benefit. And this the step that Sri Lanka has taken now is a progressive step, which is going with the IMF and going towards but I see derailing patterns coming up, which is very unfortunate. And some of the clear derailing factor is that the neoliberal project that I've mentioned, so which is saying that blaming it on neoliberalism, but then the ultranationalists would take an advantage of that, and then looking at creating that it was the crisis, the people, it was the West who was behind the crisis, and it was not China. So it's not a blame game. But I mean, today, if you look at the Sri Lankans, they are hungry. I mean, if you look at having proper 3 meals a day, there's no adequate medicine. So it's a serious crisis, and that the country is facing. So more you sort of get into this and delay the process, that the Sri Lankan people would suffer. So it's important that countries like India give leadership. I mean, India has already given the leadership, has given 4 billion. So no other country has done that. So others can follow and help Sri Lanka and get to some sort of standards, as well as the tax has to be revisited. All this, the structural adjustments are going to be very hard. It's not going to be easy. So, but it's we have to navigate it.
Thank you, Asanga. It's been a fascinating 1 hour of lecture and discussion, and I know it could go on, but I also know that it's past midnight there, and I really sort of indebted to you for doing this. When you come to Delhi for your book launch, I hope I can make up by buying coffee for you. So
thank you so much.
So,
looking forward to
seeing you. Looking forward to see you, and thank you so much on behalf of Professor Nagalakshmi Raman and my colleagues here and the student community at the MITI Institute of International Studies. It's been a fascinating discussion today. Thank you so much. And we will be bringing out an entire report on the AII's neighborhood lecture series. And once we are done with the drafting, we'll be sending for your final proof before we go ahead and make it in a publishing mode. So thank you again, Asanga, and good night, and see you soon in March in Delhi. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and all the best for your work with your neighborhood series, and thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.